is that every object that you create in JavaScript by default has this proto property pointing to the global object in JavaScript. And that will become more apparent hopefully in a little bit. Yeah, so that's what I just said. So you can think about it in this way. By default, every object is kind of inheriting from this base fundamental object in JavaScript. But what we can do is we can actually set and change that proto property. So in this first line here, we're setting Steve's proto, which we're changing its prototype, to player. So here, Steve was pointing to object, and now we've changed it to point up to player. And why that's interesting is in these next 3 lines. So I'm going to kind of emulate what JavaScript would be doing. So in this first line, we're going to try to trace out steve.name. So JavaScript's going to go to this object, and it's going to find its name property, and it's going to say Steve. But if we look for evil, it's going to look for evil here. It's not going to find it, but it's going to go up this chain, up this to its prototype, and then it's going to find evil here, and then it's going to return false. And then finally, if we look for steve.likesDiamonds, it's going to start here at Steve. It's going to move up to player. It's going to move up to this global object. Then it's going to go to null. And so that's the JavaScript mechanism to say, OK, give up. It doesn't exist. And so it's going to return undefined. So what I was just describing is the prototype chain, also known as prototype inheritance, and that's built into JavaScript, the language. And so we can then again change this prototype. So Steve was pointing to player, but we can change it now to zombie. And if we call steve.evil, this time it will return true because it will go from here down to zombie and return true here. So before going any further, I just want to mention that this proto property is the JavaScript way to access that. What you're actually accessing is what ECMAScript, which is like the more official language that JavaScript is based on. What's referred to as this bracket prototype property. And I don't say that to confuse you. I just say it so that if you see this bracket prototype in documentation or elsewhere, you can think about it as proto. They're basically one and the same thing. And then a few more notes. This proto property exists in some browsers, especially like Chrome. But it was just recently standardized in the next version of JavaScript, ECMAScript 6. So for older support, you can use object.getPrototypeOf. And also, that example that I showed was more for demonstration. Typically, you don't want to change the proto property runtime because it's very slow, and no JavaScript engine is optimized to do that kind of work. So proto is a bit weird to manipulate. So there's a new way to create objects called object.create. And I'm just going to go through this example here. We're going to have a player object with these 2 properties, player and evil, name and evil. And then we're going to, this line is where it gets interesting, where we create our new Steve object. We use object.create, and we pass in this object that we say, hey, I want Steve to use this object I'm passing in as its prototype. And so here I have a slide or a graphic that kind of shows that. It's much like the other slides I was showing you. We made our Steve object, and then we set its prototype to player, which is the first argument we passed into object.create. And object.create is very cool. It's kind of outside of the scope of this talk to go into it. But I have a link here, 2 links here that kind of go over it. So any questions so far before I continue? Yes?
The double underscore before and after, I've seen that a lot, and I never really understood where it came from. In what situations do you use it?
That's just what they called that variable. I think it was kind of meant, I'm speaking now outside of my knowledge. I kind of assumed that it was meant, that was kind of to make you think, hey, this is kind of, we're reaching into the internals. It's kind of weird. It's like we're using it for debugging. It's not something that you can just usually play around with. And even if you type _ proto in the console of like your browser, it won't autocomplete for you. But if you do type the whole thing out and then hit enter, it will show that value. Any other questions? Yeah.
Did you see where that object.create is available? What version of JavaScript is?
I think it's ECMAScript 5. Yes? OK, I'm seeing yes. Yeah. So and I believe that works in i9 and up, I think. Yes?
I I see a lot of times object.create player.prototype, not player. Is there a big difference?
I can get into that a little bit. Essentially, all you're passing in is that first argument is an object, and player.prototype is an object. So it kind of is up to what your goal is there. Okay, I want to go ahead and move on. I want to talk about constructor functions. I read an interesting blog post that kind of says that object.create is more sensical as far as creating objects. However, this is still a very key part of the language, and a lot of current and older code uses this type of format. So I want to try to explain it, and hopefully I can achieve that in this talk. So we have our constructor function here called player. So pretend like, let's say we're making a game, and we need a player object, a player class, if you will. So we have player, has 3 properties. He has a name, hit points, and a flag if they're poisoned or not. And so what we can do now is we can invoke the new operator and make new instances of that class. So we have a Steve and we have an Alex variable that are players, and we give them attributes. And then I have this interesting line here, player.magic.rollCall equals function. So what I'm doing is I'm adding this roll call method onto player.magic. So those of you who are familiar with JavaScript might find this weird, and I will explain it in a second. But just go with me on this. So then we call Steve.rollCall and Alex.rollCall, and it works. It's like we gave this class a function that all their instances are able to use. So the takeaway is that somehow, by adding properties on this magic object, somehow our class instances were able to access it. And so in other words, like I was saying before, it's kind of like a bucket to put public class methods on. So the truth is I'm lying. That object isn't called magic. But it does exist, and it's just by another name. And I changed the name to hopefully make this talk more coherent. And hopefully by the end, you'll understand why I did that. And I'll explain what it actually is called later. But I just don't want to confuse everyone right off the bat. OK, so how does this magic property work? Well, let's dig deeper to figure that out. So let's boil away our constructor function. We just have now a simple function that does nothing. And here's what we get. We get this function called player, and for some reason, it just comes with this magic object automatically. So what's going on? By default, every function in JavaScript has an object called magic. It's built into the language. And again, it's not actually called magic, but just stick with me. It does exist, it just has a different name. So what's the deal with this object? Well, let's focus on new. So we already saw this code. This is us making a new player. So what happens when we actually use the new operator? You may not be aware, but there's a couple things that JavaScript does. First, we make a brand new empty object. Then we're going to populate that object with all the things we passed into the constructor as arguments. We're going to bind this to it, which that is outside of the scope of this. I don't want to get into it too much. That could be its own talk. And then we set the object's prototype, its proto property, to that magic object. So I know that's kind of confusing, so I have a few slides that hopefully demonstrate that. So again, here's our player constructor, as you already saw. So first step is we make a brand new object. Then we're going to populate it with the various fields we passed in. So we give it a name, hit points, and if it's poisoned or not. But then what's interesting is that we set its prototype to that magic object there. And again, this is just built into JavaScript. This is how the new system and how functions work. So if you're still with me, continuing, let's make a new player called Alex. And this is what it's going to look like. We just added a new player here. We made it with the new operator. And both of their prototypes are porting to that magic object. So where it gets really interesting is we're going to add that function, that roll call method, which is just for the players to announce who they are, to that magic object. So player.magic.rollCall, that's what it would look like. We have now a function on this weird magic object. And if I boil down this diagram a bit, this is what we have. And if you remember from the beginning of the talk, this is the same type of prototype inheritance, the same type of prototype chain that we're used to. So if Steve calls roll call, JavaScript is going to look for roll call here. It's not going to find it. And it's going to move down the prototype chain to this player.magic object, and it's going to find it there. So that then if we call Steve.rollCall, it'll say, hi, my name is Steve. Alex will say, hi, my name is Alex. So to recap, when we use the new operator, we set that proto property to the constructor function's magic object, and that's just what new does. And the net result is that you can add properties to that magic object, and now all of a sudden all your instances are able to access it. Okay, so now I'm going to explain the magic thing. To come clean, this property is actually called prototype. And the reason I changed the name is because this is what the actual code looks like. It's player.prototype.rollCall. The reason I changed the name is because functions in JavaScript are going to have a prototype object, which I called magic before, and they're going to have an actual prototype, proto, and they're different things. So when I'm talking about a function, I can talk about its prototype, which points here to the global function, or I can talk about its prototype object, which is not its prototype. It's just an object that JavaScript gives you. So hopefully I'll explain this in a second, why JavaScript does this, because it's really confusing. So okay, you can see for yourself, if you make a new function and try to access, so it's a brand new function, we try to access its prototype, it will return an empty object. So it's there. When you make a new function, it will have this prototype object. And then you can also see if we make a player function and see if its prototype is equal to its, the prototype object on the function is equal to its prototype, it will return false. They are different things. So the reason I think that JavaScript does this is because really what's happening is the instances of your class, the Steve object that we created, its prototype is pointing to that function's prototype object. So when you see, for example, player.prototype, what it's referring to is it's actually referring to the prototypes of its children, of its instances of the class. So hopefully that makes somewhat sense as to why I changed the name there. Because I don't want to confuse everyone off the bat. I don't know if you're still confused, but the slides are still up there if you need to get a second run through. But moving on, prototype is dynamic. So for an example, let's say we try to access a die function on our Steve object here. And it's going to throw an error because I haven't showed you die yet. So there's no code that does that. But assuming that we could recover from that error, we could then add that die method to our player.prototype object. And then all of a sudden, when we try to run it again, it's going to work. So up here, it didn't exist. We added it, and then it works. So the reason I bring that up is that you can do interesting stuff like polyfills, for example. So if you're not familiar with that term, basically you can add features to the language in an older browser. So if you want to use the array for each method, it might not exist in IE7, IE8. So then you can check for that, and then if it doesn't exist, you can then just add it to the language using JavaScript code instead of native code. But, and this is kind of a contrived example, but you could, for example, overwrite the getTime method of date to just blow out the page and just say it's time to relax. So you would never normally do that, but what I'm trying to point out is that you don't really want to tamper with the built-in stuff in JavaScript unless you know what you're doing or it's for a polyfill. Because if you implement this code in a library and then someone uses your library on the page and they happen to use the getTime method, it's going to screw them up. And it's going to be hard for them to figure out why this is breaking for them. So note before we continue, everything I've added to this prototype object has been a function, but I just want to point out it's just an object, so we can just add values to it. So we can introduce a variable that's just a number 50, and that will work. So the final thing here is what happens when you iterate over an object in JavaScript. So we have everything we've already seen before, and now we're going to iterate over Steve. And we're going to trace out all the properties that exist on the Steve object. So we're going to get name, we're going to get hit points, we're going to get is poisoned. Those are all up here. We passed it in. But then we're also going to get roll call, which is that function that we have on its constructor's prototype object. So what you need to use in this case, or you can use, is hasOwnProperty. HasOwnProperty is the way in JavaScript where you can distinguish between things that an object actually owns itself and other things that exist further down the prototype chain. So if we then filter this for loop so that we're only looking for stuff that Steve actually owns on itself, we'll get name, hit points, is poisoned, but we won't get roll call. And that's what we want in this example. And then just to point out, there's also object.getOwnPropertyNames, which does a similar thing. It just returns an array. So summary. Every object in JavaScript has a proto property, and that points to that object's prototype. If a property can't be found on the object, JavaScript's going to use its prototype inheritance mechanism to look for that object further down its prototype chain. All functions have a prototype object, and this is different from its actual prototype. And objects with the new creator, or used with the new operator, have their proto property pointing to the constructor function's prototype, which is a confusingly named but convenient place to put class methods. And then last thing I just explained, but has own property lets you then filter out things an object owns from things that exist further down its prototype chain. So I highly recommend this first link here, a plain English guide, which I got some of my material from. And then a bunch of these links are pretty good. I have 2 books I recommend are Secrets of the JavaScript Ninja, which is by the guy that wrote jQuery, and Testable JavaScript, which is really good. And that's it. Questions? Yes.
URL?
Yeah.
And I take it you'll be pasting that as a comment right there in tonight's talk.
I will. In fact, I could maybe do that right now. If I could spell.
Oh, yeah, that's our main website. That won't post. Oh, you.
Well, I was going to go to the, yeah, except I can't. Oh, no.
You can't. That's why.
Well, okay. Let me get out of
It
this.
automatically drops it.
Okay,
as
hold
soon as
on.
it goes up there. Don't worry about it. You can put it up later.
Yeah, I'll put it up later.
Just keep an eye out for it.
There we go. So if you just go to this URL, you'll find it. Yes?
I just wanted to add on like a little bit of information to the stuff we're reading up. This is all stuff you should know, but with ECMAScript 6, classes come into play, which make this a lot easier. But there's a library out, it came out, it just like popped up out of nowhere a couple months ago called 6 to 5, and it transpiles ECMAScript 6 into ECMAScript 5. Code. So, but the goal of the developer was to make it so it's efficient but very readable code. So, if you're familiar with some other, classy or object-oriented programming language, you can easily get started writing classes in ECMAScript 6, compile it down to production ECMAScript 5 code, and really see how these, the prototype will.
That's awesome.
Works.
Cool, thank you. Other questions? Yes.
This is just sort of for my own curiosity. What's the prototype of a new function? Is it just objects?
A prototype of a new function is going to be an empty object.
Okay, but it's a different empty object than the actual prototype value on the function.
I think so.
Who's on first?
Right. I'm not sure. I'll have to get back to you. Anything
Any
else?
other questions? No more?
One more.
I guess my question is like, do you have any examples of, I guess, real world applications that use prototype.js?
Yeah.
Different type of like, or is it in this case it looks like it was like some type of game, or is it like widgets or things like that? Like,
Yeah. Yeah, so just one quick note, prototype.js is a library, just to clear that up. But yeah, so prototype, a lot of stuff written in JavaScript, if it wanted to do any sort of class-like stuff, like if you wanted to have a reusable function, a lot of it used and still uses the new operator and prototype. I think when you first start using it, it's pretty simple. It's just that when you run into things you don't expect, and then you try to dig deeper, that it gets kind of gross. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of code out there that uses this. And that's kind of why I put it up here, so to hopefully explain it as best I could. Okay.
Is that it?
Thanks, guys.